On this episode of We're No Damn Experts, we let the tapes roll while we talk with an expert about Native American history and culture in our area. The conversation is so damn good that we had to break it into 3 parts. Stay and listen to this first part that serves as an introduction to experiencing Native American history in Great Falls, Montana.
Best damn podcast, the best damn town. You wanna get up, get ready to get down. With its big wide sky and the wild river Tame. If you wanna go, we can take you there to Great Falls, Montana.
Welcome to the greatest damn town in Montana, Great Falls. I'm Rebecca Ingham.
And I'm Maricela Hazard.
And we're no damn experts. We've brought yet another expert to the podcast to introduce a man who has taught me so much about the culture and history of our community. So I'm going to welcome my friend and an amazing, influential businessman, not just in Great Falls, not just in Montana, but across the United States, James Parker Shield.
Boy, what a build-up. I'll try to live up to it, Rebecca. Nice to see you again.
It's so nice to have you here. And to our listeners, we usually have a focus of our podcast. We left our focus really just pretty loose. So we're going to be talking about the history of Native Americans in our community. And there's a lot of stories to be told here along those lines with the Missouri River, with First Peoples Buffalo Jump, the culture, the heritage, the history. We could spend days, I think, talking about this.
Yeah, you could. And Native history is kind of like gold mining. You know, you have to pan a lot of dirt in some cases to find, nuggets that are worth knowing about. Great Falls, those nuggets aren't really that hard to find. If you're a stranger, you come to Great Falls, It's not one of those places that you would think there's a lot of Native history, but beneath the surface, you find a lot. And it's unique history, too. That's the other outstanding thing about Great Falls is you'd have to kind of divide it into segments. And that's how I do it in my mind. You can get a pretty good feel for how it was for Native Americans prior to what we call contact, before there was Europeans that came into this area.
Okay.
And American exploration and fur trade, and then Lewis and Clark expedition, and then ultimately settlers. Of course, the settlers followed the gold rush and the cattle herds that came up from Texas. In Montana, prior to non-Indians coming into this area, this was a crossroads for a number of tribes. If you ask 5 or 6 different tribes in Montana or just outside of Montana, they'll all lay claim to this area.
Okay.
Notably the Blackfeet, the Shoshones, the Crows, and even the Nez Perce used to come over here from their mountain country in Idaho. They'd come across the mountains and come over here to hunt buffalo.
Okay.
So did the Kootenays. And of course the Gros Ventres were around here as well. There was even Assiniboines that drifted into this area. So there's quite a number of, tribes that would be represented, even though the predominant tribe that's mentioned in this area is the Blackfeet.
And why is that?
Because they're right north of us.
Okay, so because of their current location, they kind of still have the influence on it?
But also their historical territory stretched all the way down here across the Missouri.
Okay.
And in many cases overlapped with the claims of the Crows from down south. So this was kind of almost like a battleground, a contested ground. But the Missouri River was kind of a large demarcation line for a lot of those tribes. Not a lot of great places to cross, but the Great Falls area has shallow water in the Missouri River. So it afforded them a crossing point. And of course, the other presence here was the buffalo. Buffalo herds moving through this area, and they too needed shallow crossing areas. And the Missouri here has that.
So before we dived into this podcast and hit record, we asked you, what is the correct term we should use for Native Americans?
A lot of it depends on what period of time you're talking about.
Okay.
What was common usage. And now, of course, we're into sensitivity of making sure that somebody is called what they want to be called and not be called something else. Mm-hmm. For example, if you went back in the day of Lewis and Clark, they were helped by Sacagawea, particularly since she was well versed with the landscape, particularly in southwestern Montana. before she was taken captive by the tribe further east. In those days, you would refer to Indian women as squaws. So no big surprise that one of the main concerns that I had for many years in Great Falls was going into local restaurants that had placemats where you actually saw an island on the map and it said Squaw Island. Now that was, I guess, acceptable for people, non-Indian people, back in the day in the 40s and 50s when those placemats were popularized. But by the time I was in college here, I wrote a column in the Great Falls Tribune making an issue of that use of that term squaw. And basically it's an education where you have to educate people about where did that word come from, what was its original meaning, and how it became a disparaging word in usage against all Indian women. We mounted a campaign, myself and others in the Indian community, to get the name of that island changed and get that offensive name off placemats in restaurants. And the city government responded by changing the name as we requested. And I had suggested that if you want to honor Indian women in general, or one in particular, Sacagawea, was here with the Lewis Clark expedition. So that's why to this day, if you look at the island from Gibson Park across to the refinery area, West Bank, that large island over there, Sacagawea Island.
So I'm going to tell on myself, I didn't know that squaw was a derogatory term.
Yes.
But I've only known it as Sacagawea just because I've lived here almost 2 years, and that's all the maps that I've seen are just Sacagawea. So I'm glad you're able to do that, do the right thing.
So it's one of those little local blemishes that has been addressed and taken care of, and now it's got a positive name. So getting back to your original point, what do we call our people now? Well, it just, like I said, it depends on the period of time. The one that I like the best, other than Indians, which is kind of a generic term that so many people have gotten used to for decades, including, Native people. So that one's kind of generally acceptable, but the one that has gained most usage over the past few decades is Native American.
Okay.
Now another one has come on the horizon called Indigenous. And I know that a lot of Native advocates and academics and young people like Alyssa, they use that. My daughter uses it, but I kind of like Native American.
Okay, I'll roll with it. I'll roll with Native American. I'm used to saying Indian. And Alyssa, by the way, is your public affairs official. She's sitting right next to James.
And she's a Seneca.
And she's a Seneca with a stick, and she's ready to poke him if he misspeaks on anything.
and that gets to another point. It's really helpful if you can actually address a person by their tribe.
Oh, okay.
Because all Indians, all natives are particularly proud of who they are. They don't want to be anybody else. They wouldn't want to be any other race. They wouldn't want to be any other tribe other than what they are. And so Alyssa is from the Allegheny Reservation in upstate New York, and she's Tonawanda Seneca.
Wow. And she's now here in
part
Montana.
of the Great Six Nations Confederacy.
And so, James, what is your affiliation?
I'm Little Shell, Chippewa, and Cree. My people came here originally from the Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota, which we'll get into a little more later because that's a great deal of the history of the Indian community in Great Falls, because this is where we're located and we have a large population here.
And you're a resident of Great Falls, but that hasn't always been the case. You grew up across Montana.
Yeah, I was one of those kids that was fortunate or unfortunate enough to be bounced around a bit. I did spend pretty much most of my younger days going to school here in Great Falls at Longfellow Elementary and Pierce Gibson Junior High. Now they call them middle schools. I also lived on the Rocky Boy Reservation, and I also was raised for a few years in a state orphanage. And in my adult life, I worked on the Fort Peck Indian Reservation. I've lived on the Flathead Reservation. And I, of course, have lived a couple more times on the Rocky Boy Reservation.
So I tell you people, when I bring in an expert, I bring in a damn expert.
But I'm not an expert on damn.
No, that's to come. That's to come.
But if something pops up where you know something about a dam, feel free to share it.
Okay.
All I know
we didn't build them. I think the closest that Native people ever got to building a dam was watching beavers build them.
Yeah, well, that's a good model, too, I think, for engineering standards.
I think when you look at Great Falls, like I said earlier, you're not struck right away that, this is one of those historical places I have to go to when these tourism magnets you have to go to. And I've been to a number of places like that where you actually get more information about a place than you really need before you even get there. And so it's kind of like that place then has to live up to all the hype or all the information that you ran across before you ever get there. Like, say, for example, San Antonio. I went to San Antonio for a conference years ago. And of course, I was excited because of two reasons. The Spurs were my NBA team.
Okay. Are they still are or no?
Yeah, they're kind of there.
Okay.
So I right away, I got tickets for a Spurs game. But more importantly, I wanted to go to the Alamo.
Okay.
Something that you read about in history. And when you get there, it turns out the Alamo as we know it is relatively small compared to what the real Alamo was. You know, there's more to it. There's more to the story. And so you try not to be let down. But I did go back and visit twice more. Great Falls, like I mentioned earlier, there's not a Mecca site that you have to come and say, oh, you go right there and you'll learn everything you need to know about Native Americans in Great Falls or their community. Maybe someday they'll leave someplace like that, but you have to discover it and find it nugget by nugget. And when you do, each time I think you would go, oh.
And I think you're so true. And we've talked many a time of the need to have that venue for people to be able to engage with the Native American culture and history that's here. We don't have that yet. And we do tell people when they come that it is spread across many of our museums and cultural centers here, which I think is a really cool thing because it does spread across everything that is here. So when you go to the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center, there's pieces of that history there. When you go to the C.M. Russell Museum, there's pieces of that history there. But it's not the collective story. It's just small pieces related to that aspect.
Right. And that's a good point. But those places that you mentioned do a pretty good job. I've been to a lot of museums and visitor centers around the country, and because I've always been a history nut, and of course, Indian history is always one of the main things I'm always wanting to learn more about, not just my culture, but, people like, the Senecas, and people in the Southwest. I like to learn about other Native cultures. And I can remember always kind of having this sense that every place I visited, was a place that was put together by non-Indians.
Okay.
And that they were the ones that were putting together the information that was shared with people about, Native history and culture in that area. And usually it occupied a small percentage of that facility. It wasn't a large presentation and it wasn't in depth. I'm actually proud to say that the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center in Great Falls does probably the best job in the country. It's all about the planning. I'm one of the original founding board members of the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center. I served on that board for, I think, around 19 years. When you go to the entrance of the Interpretive Center, there's a boulder with a big plaque on it and with the board members' names. And I always think with pride that my name is right there. Because that's one of the things that's also usually missing in communities like Great Falls is you see a lot of white names on buildings and plaques and statues, but not Native names. I'm proud that my name's on there, but I'm more proud of how that place turned out because from the very beginning, I shared some of my concerns about places I've been to and how they treated Indian history. Jane Weber and her team brought in Native experts, including my mentor, my good friend George Horsecapture, who helped with the Native exhibits in there. And when you go to the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center, the first thing that you realize is that they tell the whole story about the expedition from two sets of eyes. And they actually have a carpet that runs throughout that area, and it's blue, and it's to replicate the Missouri River. And as you're going up the river like the expedition did, on the left-hand side, all the exhibits are non-Indian exhibits, all about Lewis and Clark and the country at that time, and how they put the expedition together, and their expedition, of course, coming up. On the right-hand side is all about natives. It's all about the people that they interacted with, the native villages they visited, the winter they stayed with the Mandans, their trade, with tribes where they needed to get horses or information or supplies. And they did a great job in there of explaining the differences between those native cultures that they encountered on that expedition, going all the way to the Pacific Coast in Astoria, Oregon. And the other thing that the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center did was when it was completed and we held the grand opening ceremony, they made sure that there was representation from the tribes that they had gotten information from. They didn't just get information, use them, and then leave them. They made sure they were involved in that process throughout. And of course, at the grand opening ceremony, they also made sure that that dual representation continued. There was co-MCs for the event. One of the MCs was the mayor of Big Falls, the other was me.
Oh.
And I made sure that we continued that and we had a traditional red ribbon cutting of the event, but it was consisted of braids of sweetgrass. And then at the very end, it had red ribbon that we cut with these oversized scissors.
Oh, when did that open? When was the ribbon cutting ceremony?
89, somewhere around there. I kind of lost track. It's been a long time. I still have photos of it. They continue to do a good job. You know, they always make sure that there's staff over there, especially in the summertime, that are native, and they bring in a lot of people from the surrounding reservations and do presentations on Indian history and culture. And so if we had a Mecca, that would probably be at the top of the list. As far as if you want to learn about Native history and culture, you know, on the Northern Plains where the expedition went. And of course, they spent a lot of time here in Montana because they had to portage around those waterfalls.
Yeah.
And so that means they were kind of stuck here for a whole month, and they spent a lot of time here. So there's a lot of information that they were able to put into their journals about not only the plants and the animals and stuff, but even the tribes they dealt with.
And then the First Peoples Buffalo Jump. That interpretive center is a little bit smaller, well, considerably smaller compared to the huge building that is the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center.
Yeah, but unknown history. See, it's always about digging up the nugget. The unknown history is I have photographs of a meeting that was held on top of the Buffalo Jump before that visitor center was ever built. Because at that time, Department of Fish, Wildlife, Parks was planning to build a visitor center. And a group of us, including myself, we actually went to Canada to the head smashed in Buffalo Jump by Edmonton, not Edmonton, Lethbridge.
Yeah.
And of course, it's an impressive place because it's built right into the face of the cliff of the Buffalo Jump. And it's got a lot of space, a lot of interesting exhibits and all that. But there's only one problem. From the perspective of Native people, it was kind of a sacrilege to build into your Buffalo Jump.
Okay, yeah.
And Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, from the state of Montana at that time, was actually thinking about building the visitor center on top of the Buffalo Jump. And so there was a meeting that was put together by officials from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and then they invited representation from the surrounding tribes, including our local Indian community, which at that time I was representing. And after we had the opening pipe ceremony, which I refused to take part in because according to our way, if you were going to say bad words or not have, if you're going to be like negative, you don't really want to smoke the pipe. You want to do that ceremony in a good way. So I stayed out of the pipe ceremony, and then after it was completed, then Fish, Wildlife, and Parks introduced me as the first speaker. And I stood up, and basically it was almost like reminiscent of those old historical treaties.
Yeah.
Where you've got the representatives from the United States government, and they're trying to talk you out of more of your land or
convince
make
you to do it their way.
or whatever. Yeah. And then you got the native representatives. So I stood and I made basically this impassioned speech to my native brothers that were there. I told them, I said, I didn't smoke the pipe, and you guys understand why. I said, because what I'm about to say is not going to be positive about this whole idea. I said, you have to understand that you're here to be used. I said, you were brought in here as representatives from your reservations as a kind of a buffer between Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and our local Native community that doesn't want a visitor center built on top of the Buffalo Jump. I hope that you guys will support our position, which they ultimately did. And so Fish, Wildlife, and Park, in all its wisdom, ultimately decided to build a visitor center down below where it sits now.
Yes, so you can enter it, for the people that haven't been there yet, you can enter it on the lower section and then you can hike your way up to the top, or you can get back in your car, drive the 3 miles, is it? 2 or 3 miles?
I do it the traditional native way. I get in my pickup and I go to the top.
And you park up there.
And I leisurely stroll over to the edge.
Yeah, then
Perfect.
they have their upper visitor center parking area with little warning signs that, hey, there's some rattlesnakes in the area. But it is paved and you can usually get there quickly.
The best part of it is that when they visit the buffalo jump, they just get out and they automatically just want to get to that edge where the buffalo, were stampeded over as quick as possible. But really, to get a full understanding of a place like the buffalo jump, you have to understand how they were used. And the only way you can do that is you have to actually turn around and face backwards. Then you'll notice that there are stones that are in a line that come to get, like a shape like a V. There's an apex that comes to that buffalo jump, and there's these broad lines made out of stone, and those are drive lines. Cattle are relatively easy to herd. Buffalo, you don't herd buffalo. So you have to kind of influence them to a certain point or direction you want them to go. And then at the critical moment where you have them where you want them, then you want to stampede them into where they're going over the edge of the cliff and the others are pushing them behind and they can't stop. And of course, they don't die automatically just because they went over a cliff. A lot of them were injured, so then they would have to be finished off down below by people waiting down there with spears and bows and arrows.
Thanks for explaining the technicality of the buffalo jump, because I assume everyone knew what a buffalo jump was. And no. Turns out I was visiting with some people in Chicago, and you mentioned Head Smashed In, and our Albertan friends, they do love Head Smashed In. Ours is bigger and better. Not to brag, but I was in Chicago sharing with people about the First Peoples Buffalo Jump, and they're like, exactly what does that mean? Like, what is a buffalo jump? Does a place weird buffalo jump around? I'm like, oh, this is going to be fun now to explain.
As that hip hop song in the background, jump around.
Jump around.
Bunch of buffalo.
Yeah, that's exactly what they started thinking. I'm like, oh no, this is a place where Native Americans would run buffalo off a cliff to their death. And to see some of their faces just immediately go, I'm like, well, there wasn't guns, to shoot the animals at that time. That didn't come until later. So this was a method that they used to be able to get their meat, their bones, the fur,
everything,
whole thing.
Yeah. The way I've explained it, especially when you speak to school kids, younger ones, I try to put it in such a way that they can kind of understand the concept. Is I tell them, what would you do if your neighborhood grocery store, one morning you woke up and the store that had only been 4 blocks away from your house was now a mile away from your house? I said, it'd be pretty hard for you to jack up your house and move so you could stay close enough to that grocery store that seemed to keep moving every few days. I said, well, the buffalo were the grocery store of its day, on the northern and southern plains for tribes there, because that's where we got our food and clothing. So your store keeps grazing, and as it grazes, it moves, it walks, and it keeps getting further and further away from you. So that's why a lot of the tribes out in the plains country had portable houses called teepees, because you could put them up and take them down real quick. And more importantly, you could keep up with your grocery store as it moved every few days. And I said, there was that method of just sticking around your store, or if they got away from you, or you lost track of them, or you depleted and hunted out that particular herd, you had to find another one. That wasn't always easy. And then when you did find them, this is in the days before the Indians got the horse. So how did you hunt the buffalo? Buffalo can be, they can be spooked and they'll just stampede and run off by themselves. And they're dangerous. They have horns, they'll gore you, they'll run over you.
This entire process seems dangerous, so...
Yeah, the whole thing's dangerous. That's why, it was an act of bravery to be able to kill buffalo, especially when you're younger. So there was a number of methods, and it depended on the weather too. In warm weather, you could, once you located a herd and you didn't have horses, you were on foot, which meant that you had to walk up to that herd. They don't see too well, but they're easily spooked. So you, in essence, have to sneak up on them. And one of the the favorite methods was to pretend that you were a wolf or a coyote, because they were used to wolves and coyotes hanging around the perimeter of the herd, waiting for a weak calf that they could kill one of the younger buffaloes to die or fall over so they could feed on it. So you would have native men crawling on all fours wearing a wolf skin cover over them. And you would try to get close enough to where you could shoot them with your bow and arrow or with a spear. And, of course, that doesn't always mean that you'd be able to bring that buffalo down, because you have to hit them in the right spot to mortally wound them. And if you don't, then you're going to have to put, more arrows into them. Another method in the wintertime would be to chase them into deep snow, big drift, where it would slow them down to where you could actually surround them and then gang up on them and finish them off that way. Or you could catch them swimming across a river, So there's a lot of different methods. And using a buffalo jump is just one, but it's the one that's most effective numbers-wise, because you can get a lot of buffalo in just that one maneuver. But it takes a lot of planning. A buffalo jump basically involves being a professional event planner. So if you put on a wedding or a political rally, you could probably plan a buffalo.
I love it.
I don't think I'm capable, but
Jennifer Lopez might be able to from the wedding planner. Have her little caboodle of
and you can see a little romance story going on.
Yep, exactly.
There's always got to be that.
Someone write this down.
Make it our next movie.
Yes.
Our next promotional video for Great Falls.
But and of course, as Rebecca mentioned, there's a number of buffalo jumps around the country, especially out in this region. Mm-hmm. But we have the biggest.
I'm from north of Chicago, and I didn't know what a buffalo jump was. I come here and First People's buffalo jump, largest. Yeah. So we went to the lower portion, went up top, and then we saw how big it is, and just kind of got a little overwhelmed. It's
it's higher than you think.
It is.
When you look at it from a distance, you go, it's a small hill, a couple rocks. Then you get on top of it, and you go, holy cow, that's a long way to fall down. Mm-hmm. And so it was effective. And then, of course, keep in mind, that was only the first part of the buffalo jump experience. You actually had a whole camp set up down below. And usually there were some of the men that would do the finishing off of killing the wounded buffalo. Mm-hmm. And then the women would come in and then start the butchering process. And then you had further away, you had to process some of the meat right away, or you might even stay there for a while and start making provisions for the winter by creating pemmican, which is a mixture of buffalo meat, kind of some of the fat or suet mixed with choke cherries and other berries that they had gathered. You could mix that in there and make pemmican. And that would be your winter power bar supply.
Thanks for breaking it down to me on these event planning and power bars.
See, us Indians, we're used to explaining things in your cultural understanding.
You mentioned that you had to follow your grocery store quite a bit. And so there are throughout Montana, or even just throughout this area, some on private land, some on public land, other buffalo jumps, other campsites, because you had to follow your grocery store and you didn't get to pack up the jump with you and take it. Yeah,
kind of a secret, but there actually is, in my mind, a better buffalo jump. It's out in the Birdtail region around here near what we call Cascade. Okay. And it's on private land. And I was invited to come and take a look at it because a friend of mine had gotten word that the woman wanted to develop her land. And he said, you might want to come and take a look at this, James. So I went out there, drove across a wheat field, and then approached these hills and that had a narrow opening, and went in through the narrow opening, and then it opened up to a small little valley that had a creek running through it and 30 teepee rings that were real close to each other. And then from the teepee rings, you went around another rock outcropping, and then right in front of you was this very steep buffalo jump. I always thought the state of Montana should buy this, protect it. But right now, as far as I know, it's still in private hands. But the last time I drove out that way a few years ago, they fenced off the access, which is a good thing.
Okay. Otherwise, I was gonna go look for it today.
Yeah.
Bring my camera.
Mine doesn't have any boundaries.
You'd find out what private land means real fast.
I hear you have to ask permission.
Exactly. Yeah. But yeah, there's places like that, but there's other places that are getting more public notice. Like I think I went up somewhere outside of Lewistown where they have the petroglyphs.
Yep.
And a ranch family owns that place.
Okay.
And they've got some real nice preserved petroglyphs in there. And fortunately, that family is looking after it. But they do allow people to come in. And I told Alyssa I'd take her out there this summer so she can see it herself.
Which is interesting. The next progression, the history of Native Americans is traditionally told orally. It's not a lot of written books that people can pick up. Today they can because historians have written those stories down, but the way you're raised is mostly by oral story. So the petroglyphs add kind of the written component to it, does it not?
Exactly. That's why I've always looked at it. That and another good source of history is what might be on buffalo hides, where they make white people refer to as calendars or winter counts. But basically, a lot of your buffalo hide artwork was almost like a timeline of important events within that tribe or that family. And of course, the artwork is one-dimensional. It's flat, almost like stick figures. It's kind of a fascinating thing to be able to decipher what they mean. I mean, the same kind of experience that you would have with looking at history from Egypt when they go in those tombs and the pyramids, and they have all those different kinds of figures. They eventually figured out what those forms meant. That's the same way that you would look at something like a buffalo hide with its calendar of events. Is you eventually figure out what those figures mean, and you're able to read the whole story.
So the buffalo hides that are used for teepees,
yes.
In that sense, is that where they normally are?
No, they're just on a hide. It would be hung up.
Okay.
Or laid out.
I went to Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center and they were talking about the teepees and the art on it. It's not just anything you like. It's supposed to be meaningful and it's a story.
That's completely different.
Okay.
The buffalo hide with figures on it, a lot of times will have battles, or it'll have in other important events like smallpox that came into a tribe and killed a lot of people, or it would have a bad winter, or maybe when somebody fought and killed a grizzly bear barehanded. Whereas on a teepee, the artwork on a teepee, for the most part, is spiritual.
Okay.
It's more about, the belief system of that tribe, and each one of those is tied into that person or that family that owns that teepee. They'll have different designs that have different meanings, and it's basically their medicine or something that means something spiritual to them.
Okay.
You don't just slap a design on a teepee. A lot of people think, oh, how cute, how artistic. It may be artistic, but it's not done haphazardly. It's done for a purpose and with meaning. And some of that is those images are handed down. Even the right to use that image has to be handed down the right way. And not all teepees are painted for that reason.
So this concludes the first part of our conversation with James Parker Shield. Don't worry, the tapes continue to roll and we talk about powwows, rodeos, and their cultural significance. We'll release part 2 of this series in February, so stay on the lookout.
We're No Damn Experts is the recorded claims from Great Falls, Montana, covering what you need to know about this amazing damn town. Damn, that felt good.
On the next episode of We're No Damn Experts, Rebecca and Monty celebrate their love for puns with telling you how to walk the walk or talk the talk with an episode about walking tours in Great Falls, Montana. We're No Damn Experts was produced by Great Falls, Montana Tourism with original music by the best damn musician, Joel Corda.